So today the topic of our seminar is negotiating the 2015 climate agreement, issues relating to legal form and nature. For those of you who are relatively new to CPR seminars, these are fairly informal. We normally start with a speaker. In this case, my colleague Professor Lavanya Rajamani will kick us off with a 20 to 25 minute presentation. And then we're very, very pleased to have with us two discussants to take the discussion forward. The first, of course, is extremely well known to all of you, Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, who's retired from the Indian Foreign Service after a very long and distinguished career. Even though most of us are familiar with most of his accomplishments, I still pulled out his bio, and there's always things to be surprised by. So Ambassador Dasgupta was ambassador to the European Union, Belgium, and China, as well as a series of other posts, of course. And we know him from his role in the climate negotiations, leading the Indian delegation from its very, very early days in 1992 and playing a key role all the way through until 2010, and is currently on the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. Ambassador Dasgupta also has a distinguished parallel career in diplomatic history that many of you may not be as familiar with, and of course, in a very apt recognition, was awarded the Padma Bhushan quite recently. So we're really, really pleased to have Ambassador Dasgupta, who's a close friend and we're graced by his presence on many of our seminars. In addition, we have another formal discussant, who is Professor Luther Rangreji from the Faculty of Legal Studies at South Asian University. So welcome to you. And Professor Rangreji has a PhD in Legal Studies from JNU and also a series of other degrees from other universities. Has written widely, in addition to climate change, on the law of the sea and the legal control of genetically modified organisms, among other things. In addition, I really want to welcome Mr. Mosca, who of course is another leading light of the Indian climate pantheon, who's led the negotiation team more recently and is currently leading the effort at ORF on climate change. So we look forward to your remarks as well from the floor, sir. So with that, let me open it up and give it to Lavanya to kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Navroz. Given the level of expertise in this room, I'm going to delve straight into the legal issues and the details of these negotiations without spending any time on the background. But if you do need me to provide more context, please feel free to ask me to elaborate in the discussions section of the seminar. I'm going to start by providing a quick outline of what I'm going to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to start by identifying the key legal issues that are emerging in these negotiations. And in that context, I'm going to look at the instruments that we expect to come out of the Paris conference, or the Paris package, or the Paris outcome as it's is coming to be known, and the criteria for placing sort of particular provisions or particular issues or particular instruments across instruments in the Paris package.
Might be this.
Okay. Among the key legal issues is the issue of legal form of the 2015 agreement. It's one of the two most salient issues in these negotiations, what the legal form of this core 2015 agreement will be. It could be a protocol, it could be another legal instrument or agreed outcome with legal force. I'm going to look at each of these in turn and discuss the implications of each of these. The other core legal issue that's emerging is the legal nature of the nationally determined contributions that countries will put forward as part of this Paris outcome or Paris package. In that context, I will discuss options for where these nationally determined contributions might be housed, options for how they might be anchored in the 2015 agreement, and by anchored I mean what the commitments might be in the 2015 agreement in relation to these nationally determined contributions. I'm going to discuss briefly the extent to which there could be differentiation in the nationally determined contributions. The fact that these nationally determined contributions will be different for different countries the fact that they will be different for different countries is clear from the fact that actually these are nationally determined. So there'll be self-differentiation, but is there some scope for differentiating them in the agreement as well, differentiating between developed and developing countries, differentiating between adaptation and mitigation and finance, So I'm going to briefly discuss that, and I'm going to finally discuss how we might transition from the intended nationally determined contributions, which is what are being put forward now by various countries, to nationally determined contributions or commitments or whatever they come to be known as in the 2015 agreement itself. So to start with, I'm going to start with the Geneva negotiating text and the footnote, the first footnote of the Geneva negotiating text, which actually gives you an indication of the key legal issues in these negotiations. So the first footnote reads, "This negotiating text reflects work in progress and is without prejudice to whether the outcome will be a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force." If I could just pause there for a minute, this language is reminiscent of the Durban Platform decision, which launched the negotiations towards a 2015 agreement and launched the ADP, or the ad hoc group on the Durban Platform process. And this is exactly the language that's in that decision. So the negotiating text is without prejudice to the outcome, whether it will be a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force. And this is the issue of legal form. The negotiating text is also without prejudice to the legal nature of any particular provision, which refers to two things. It could be the legal nature of particular provisions within a legally binding instrument. So you could have a legally binding instrument such as a protocol, which has some provisions that lend themselves to enforcement and some provisions that don't. So this is meant to preclude that sort of construction that, all provisions are legally binding or all are not. But essentially, it's that's one element of this legal nature of particular provisions. The other element is the legal nature of nationally determined contributions, and that issue is something that was raised also in the Warsaw decision, which essentially invited parties to prepare and submit intended nationally determined contributions in the context of the 2015 agreement. And the paragraph in the decision in Warsaw that asked parties to prepare these INDCs, as they've come to be known, also contained a disclaimer with respect to the legal nature of these INDCs. So the two issues that we've already identified are legal form of the agreement, which has been thus far left undetermined, and the legal nature of particular provisions within this agreement, as well as the legal nature in particular of the nationally determined contributions that would be part of this agreement. And the second part of this footnote reads, "Inclusion of headings and subheadings are intended to orient the reader. Further, they do not indicate agreement as to the structure or organization of the agreement, or which provisions should appear in the agreement versus in decisions adopted in Paris or thereafter," which raises the issue of a package in Paris. There is an expectation that we'll have a package of instruments in Paris. It's not just going to be an outcome with legal force or another legal instrument or a protocol. You will likely also have other instruments in Paris. And this is for a variety of reasons, foremost because of the breadth and depth that is being covered in these negotiations. It would not be sensible to include all of that in a legally binding agreement, so we'll find different sort of houses for different material. Also in relation to the political salience or sort of extent of contentiousness, in a sense, of some of these issues. If they're particularly contentious, it might be difficult for them to end up in the legally binding instrument. It might make more sense, or the compromise reached might be that they end up in COP decisions or other instruments. So there are several reasons why we are expecting a package outcome. But given this package outcome, one of the issues that arises, and this is a sort of legal policy issue in a sense, it's not a strict legal issue, is how you determine what elements will end up in the 2015 core agreement, which presumably will be legally binding, and what elements will end up in other instruments in the package. So what I'm going to do now is to actually start by briefly discussing the placement issue, which is a sort of crossover legal policy issue, looking briefly at criteria that one might take into account in determining what ends up in a legally binding instrument and what does not. And then I will delve in much greater detail into the legal form of the 2015 agreement and legal nature of nationally determined contributions. So what are the instruments that we're expecting in the Paris package? Or, these are possible instruments that will be part of the Paris package. A core 2015 agreement and this most expect will be a legally binding instrument, possibly with annexes, appendices, attachments, or schedules. You could have COP decisions, and you will likely have COP decisions. COP decisions both to flesh out what is in the core 2015 agreement as well as to complement it. So it's not just something that will flesh out what's in the core 2015 agreement, but may also cover issues that are not covered in the 2015 agreement. And a thing to keep in mind about COP decisions is that absent explicit authorization from the parent treaty, which in this case is the UNFCCC, COP decisions are not legally binding. Conference of Parties. So the Conference of Parties of the to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Another likely element of the Paris package are supplementary instruments such as national schedules, registries, miscellaneous or information documents, and each of these have particular connotations in the negotiations. Miscellaneous or information documents have been used in the past. So, for instance, the Cancun pledges are in information documents. Kyoto second commitment targets are in Cancun, which came out of the Cancun package, are also in information documents. They are formal documents in the process, in that they have the UNFCCC masthead, and they will be numbered, but they will not be translated into all the UN languages. So they don't have the degree of formality that some other instruments do, but they are formal instruments. It's worth keeping in mind that these sorts of instruments don't have any sort of prescriptive element in them, can't have any prescriptive element in them. So information documents are meant just to provide information. So, for instance, you have the Cancun pledges in an information document, but you also have the list of participants to each of these negotiations in information documents. That's what they're used for. Miscellaneous documents are typically submissions of parties. Again, it's just raw submissions from parties. There's sort of no prescriptive element to them at all as far as the Conference of Parties is concerned. So these are just tools to provide information to the Conference of Parties. There is also a possibility of having political declarations. Now, political declarations in the climate negotiations have proven to be quite useful when, for instance, you can't get consensus in the COP, and this was the case in Geneva. This is COP 1. COP 2, sorry. You have the Geneva Ministerial Declaration, and the reason it was the Ministerial Declaration was because there was no consensus in the Conference of Parties on it. The Copenhagen Accord is another example, and perhaps the most salient example. It does and did have considerable operational significance and considerable heft, despite the fact that it's not actually a Conference of Parties decision or a legally binding instrument. So, for instance, if we have, in the 2015 negotiation context, if we have a problem with finding an agreement on finance, it might end up in a complementary political declaration to the entire package of instruments. How do we determine what should go into different instruments, whether they should be in COP decisions or in the legally binding instrument? This is actually an issue that might seem quite esoteric, but this is the issue right now, because the negotiating text is 86 pages long. They spent 2 weeks in June trying to whittle it down, and they managed to whittle it down by 5%. So a lot of the material in that text is actually not suitable for a legally binding instrument. And if we have an understanding that we're working towards a legally binding instrument, some material needs to be out and some material needs to be in that agreement. So what are the kind of criteria that have been put forward for determining what's in the agreement and what's not in the agreement? So the co-chairs of the ADP did actually, in their scenario note for the June session, actually have a draft sort of COP decision and a draft sort of the agreement, what would go where. So they wanted parties to start populating that, but they didn't end up getting that far. One sort of criteria is the legal nature of the provision. So if it is a provision that creates a substantive new obligation, or is a provision that you would like to be legally binding, then it needs to be in the legally binding instrument, or at least needs to be provided for in the legally binding instrument. So this might be the case, for instance, with nationally determined contributions, even if they're not part of the legally binding instrument. you can make sure they're legally binding by having a provision in the instrument that relates to them and having commitments that suggest that they're legally binding. So legal nature is a criteria for where these where provisions might end up. Dynamism, so if something needs to be constantly updated, it may not make sense to have it as part of the core agreement, because then you will need an amendment to change it every time you wanted to update something. This is of course not a sort of hard and fast rule. It's possible to have material and annexes to an international instrument that have fast track amendment procedures, so it's possible to make it sort of quicker, but in general, if you want something to be rapidly, something that's subject to rapid evolution and change and updating, then you probably don't want it as part of the core legal agreement. The level of detail, again, a core legal agreement, you don't want a great deal of detail in it, and you see examples in both the Kyoto Protocol and the UNFCCC. For instance, the compliance procedure under the Kyoto Protocol, there are 3-4 sentences on it. Emissions trading, 2 sentences on it in the Kyoto Protocol. All the details were fleshed out in Conference of Parties decisions. Political salience and political contestation are sort of two sides of the same coin. Some countries want certain provisions in the legally binding instrument because that would signal a certain level of political salience. So for instance, whether it's loss and damage or even the nationally determined contributions, the small island states want it in the legally binding instrument because that signals the highest expression of political will with respect to that issue. But at the same time, these are the very same issues that are highly contested. So if they're highly contested, countries and those countries that contest it are not likely to be willing to put it into a legally binding instrument. So, so you might find that some issues end up outside the legally binding instrument, not because they're less important, but because they're highly contested. One sort of criteria that's been put forward, which is arguable and debatable, is the level at which it is determined, the provision. So some people are arguing, some scholars are arguing that if it is a bottom-up sort of element, so if it's nationally determined, then it should not be in the core agreement. It should be in supplementary instruments. But if it's internationally determined, it should be in the core agreement. So that's one criteria that's being suggested. Urgency in implementation is also relevant. It's worth keeping in mind that if we want something to be implemented immediately, the legally binding instrument is not the way to do that, because it took 8 years for the Kyoto Protocol to enter into force. There are ratification procedures that will have to be sort of initiated in countries. It'll take several years for it to come into force if it's in the legally binding instrument. So if you want it to be implemented immediately effective, it makes more sense to have it in a Conference of Parties decision. But of course, it's possible to have it both in a Conference of Parties decision and in the legally binding instrument. And the final criteria is whether you want whatever you agree to be extended to all the UNFCCC parties or only to those that actually are subscribed to the 2015 agreement. Because depending on how much of a compromise the 2015 agreement is, it might have only limited participation. If you want something to be applicable to all the UNFCCC parties, the COP decision route might be the best one right now, because the UNFCCC is an agreement that has attracted universal participation. So moving on to the legal form of the core 2015 agreement, the Durban platform, as I said, launched a process towards a protocol, another legal instrument or agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all. So I'm going to look at each of these terms in turn. Protocol, another legal instrument, agreed outcome with legal force, and the term under the convention as well. So protocol is a known method of evolving the framework convention or the climate change regime, and that's what we did with the Kyoto Protocol, and this is a clear way of evolving the regime here, and it's one of the 3 options provided for as the outcome of the 2015 negotiations. And the protocol could have annexes, appendices, attachments that are integral part of the instrument. Article 17 that provides for protocols doesn't tell you what the content of the protocol should be or even what it's called. It only tells you that you need to provide 6 months notice and you need to have a negotiating text 6 months in advance if you're putting forward a protocol for adoption. And this has been submitted, so it's been complied with. What's interesting in the context of the protocol is, if we go down that route, is that the protocol has to determine its own entry into force requirements. And while it might seem like something we can leave to the last minute, there are quite significant implications of how an instrument enters into force. You could have just a minimum number of parties, which means it would very quickly enter into force. If you say, well, 20 parties have to ratify it and enter into force. But so you'd have, quick entry into force, but it may not be very effective because these 20 parties may not be the ones causing most of the greenhouse gas emissions. So you could have a requirement that specific parties be part of this instrument, and we have some examples of that in international law. You could actually name particular parties and say for instance, India and China and the US, or you could specify certain emissions that these countries have to make sure that those countries are part of the entry into force requirements. You could also have an emissions threshold. So you could have sort of a percentage of global emissions, like we did in the Kyoto Protocol, 55% of emissions of Annex 1 parties and 55 parties altogether. So you could have a percentage of global emissions to make sure it's effective. And you could also propose a specified date by which it needs to enter into force. But that, of course, will depend upon the ratification statistics of the instrument. But it's something that now parties are beginning to discuss how this protocol or legal instrument or treaty will enter into force. In addition to a protocol, the Conference of Parties also has power to adopt amendments to the FCCC, amendments to annexes. It can also adopt related legal instruments. And there are provisions in the Framework Convention that refer to related legal instruments, which seems to suggest that the Conference of Parties has implicit powers to adopt related legal instruments. And why this becomes significant is because of the Americans. The Americans are keen to avoid using the term protocol. They have there's negative resonance with the term protocol domestically. They cannot go back to Congress with a protocol. So they are very keen not to use the term protocol, and they're very keen not to refer to Article 17, which provides for protocols when they agreed to this new instrument. It's possible to adopt a new instrument without reference to Article 17 and without calling it a protocol. All we need is that it be a treaty, and the Vienna Convention says that a treaty is any instrument that's concluded between states in written form and governed by international law. And in fact, it very specifically says whatever its particular designation. So it doesn't matter what it's called. It could be called an implementing agreement. It could be called a Paris thingamajig. It doesn't matter, as long as it's written between states and it's governed by international law. It's a legally binding instrument. Is a treaty.
Not calling it a protocol avoid the ratification process.
Inter alia, they are trying to also ensure that there are no legally binding elements that would pinch them, and if they find an instrument that conforms very much to what they have already domestically, then they will be able to adopt this instrument by executive action, is what they're by presidential order.
That's US. Other countries?
No, the other countries, I don't know. It depends on domestic sort of ratification sort of procedures and systems in different countries. But most other countries don't have a problem with calling it protocol or anything else. It's only the Americans that have a real concern with calling it a protocol. So the agreed outcome with legal force was a term that was a result of the India-EU huddle in Durban. It could be an outcome that derives legal force from domestic rather than international law. So the other two options, protocol and another legal instrument, are options that derive their legal force from international law. There's a possibility that this language allows us to have an outcome in Durban which derives force from domestic rather than international law. That was the possibility that was provided for with this third option. And so arguably the Durban mandate would actually be fulfilled if there was a COP decision at the end of Paris that either requested parties or invited parties or encouraged parties to actually impart domestic legal force to their nationally determined contributions. But and this is a theoretical possibility, and it's still on the table. One of the early Indian submissions refers to this sort of possibility. But there is now an emerging understanding that a COP decision would not be sufficient, and we do need a legally binding instrument. But we need a legally binding instrument that's under the convention. What does this actually mean? This was negotiated, and it was seen as quite a significant achievement for developing countries, in a sense, to have this term. What does it actually mean? Any instrument adopted by the COP pursuant to particular provisions that I didn't go into the details of, but particular provisions with respect to protocols, amendments, annex amendments, will automatically be under the convention. But several provisions of the convention actually expressly apply to related legal instruments. This is basically the provision on the objective of the convention. So the objective of the convention, Article 2, automatically applies to any related legal instruments that the COP might adopt. Article 7.2 reviews the implementation of commitments by the Conference of Parties, and that too applies to related legal instruments. And the provision on dispute settlement, which also applies to related legal instruments. So there is an argument to be made, and the Americans were making it, that under the convention only means that provisions of the convention that are specifically required to apply to related legal instruments will apply. So this new legal instruments only needs to conform to the objective, needs to conform to, needs to have similar dispute settlement sort of provisions, and needs to subject itself to the COP for implementation review. But the negotiating context of the Durban platform suggests, and as many of you know, there was a debate at the time about the principle of CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibilities, and whether it should be in the mandate provided for launching these negotiations or not. And the compromise reached was that the term under the convention would actually implicitly engage the principles, but there was no explicit mention of the principles of the convention. So the negotiating context suggests that at least the principles of the convention will remain applicable. But do we need anything else? Can anything else also be sort of brought within the context of under the convention? And the like-minded developing countries have been arguing that it's not just these specific provisions, like the Americans have been arguing, that apply to related legal instruments, that it's also the principles, provisions, and structure of the convention, which they think needs to be replicated in the 2015 agreement. So their submissions, for instance, repeatedly say 2015 agreement must not rewrite, restructure, replace, or reinterpret the convention or its principles. But there are, of course, question marks on these terms, because for one, there is, if you're talking about reinterpreting the convention, there's no stable interpretation of the convention, and that's clear from the discussion on the principles of CBDRRC or any of those. There is no stable interpretation. So to be able to reinterpret it, you don't actually have a benchmark to determine what we're reinterpreting. And as far as rewriting or replacing the convention, amendments are actually possible. Another legal instrument in the context was also used in the Berlin Mandate, which launched the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, and that referred to amendments. So assuming that protocol, another legal instrument or agreed outcome with legal force, includes amendments, then it's certainly possible to actually amend the convention. So you would actually be rewriting it or rewriting it or replacing provisions. So amendments are possible. And as far as the annexes of Kyoto and FCCC, the very strong argument has been made that these annexes should be replicated in the 2015 agreement. But it's worth keeping in mind that even the annexes of Kyoto Protocol and FCCC are not identical, and by that I mean Annex 1, for instance, is not identical to Annex B. So it's certainly possible to actually have slightly different annexes for whatever reasons. So if there is sort of openness on that, it's possible the 2015 agreement might have different participation and different sort of structure as far as the annexes are concerned. So moving on to the legal nature of the nationally determined contributions, the first sort of point I'd like to make is that there is a clear distinction between intended nationally determined contributions and nationally determined contributions. And in fact, the term nationally determined contributions is just sort of a placeholder, because we don't actually know whether they're going to be called commitments, whether they're going to be called actions, whether they're going to be called something else entirely. All we know is that the Warsaw Decision invited parties to provide intended nationally determined contributions in the context of the 2015 agreement. And the basis for these INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions, is the Warsaw Decision, which is a COP decision. And it's not clear where they're going to be housed. Right now, they're just housed on the website. There's a portal, INDC portal, and parties put their INDCs up on that. Whereas nationally determined contributions, by which I mean those contributions that will be finalized and will end up in the 2015 outcome, whether in the agreement or outside the agreement, the legal basis for them will be different, the housing issue still has to be determined, all of that still has to be determined. So there is a clear distinction between them, and when I'm talking about legal nature, I'm talking about the legal nature of the nationally determined contributions, not the intended nationally determined contributions. So the legal nature of NDCs depends on a couple of different things, but primarily on the commitments prescribed in relation to them in the core 2015 agreement. So there are two sort of related issues here. One is housing, that is where these nationally determined contributions are actually going to be placed, located, housed, as the term is come to be known, and anchoring, as in how we anchor them. So wherever they're housed, what is the commitment in relation to them in the 2015 agreement? And in relation to that commitment or anchoring, as it were, the language of that provision matters, the content of that provision matters, the precision matters, and the location matters as well. Location in terms of where within that legal instrument it's actually, that provision is actually located. So I'll discuss anchoring and commitments first, and then housing in a minute. So anchoring, the key question is what commitments should we actually have in relation to these nationally determined contributions, commitments, or whatever they're called. And there are two sets of sort of ideas you could sort of use to construct them. Commitments could be procedural commitments, so they just could be commitments, for instance, to submit the nationally determined contribution, or they could be substantive contributions, or they could also be additionally substantive obligations to actually implement and achieve these contributions. Contributions could also be just obligations of effort, or they could be obligations of result. And we need to keep both these sort of distinctions in mind when we look at the kinds of commitments that parties are trying to negotiate for themselves in relation to the nationally determined contributions. So parties could be required to just prepare and communicate their nationally determined contributions. So these are just procedural commitments. They could be asked to maintain and update it, again, just procedural commitments. They could be asked to implement it, and these could be sort of a mix of procedure and substantive commitments. They could be asked to demonstrate legal force of their nationally determined contributions in domestic law. They could be asked to demonstrate that these nationally determined contributions are actually more than or have sort of progressed beyond the earlier commitments they had. And finally, and this would be the most sort of at the ambitious end of the spectrum, they could actually be asked to achieve their nationally determined contributions. In terms of the politics of this, the US, for them, either an obligation to implement or an obligation to achieve their nationally determined contributions are clear red lines. Partho?
All this stuff is what people are talking about.
These are options in the negotiating text. Something surprising?
Goes way beyond INTCs being some fluff stuff.
Well, I'm getting to the politics of it. As I said, implement and achieve are clear red lines for the US, so it's quite likely that we're not going to end up with a nationally determined contribution for parties and with commitments to achieve them or commitments to actually implement them. What the Americans in particular are arguing for is nationally determined contributions that they're obliged to prepare, communicate, maintain, update, and possibly, a commitment with respect to progression with reference to previous commitments, but they don't necessarily want that commitment in the context of the nationally determined contribution. They might even want it in a COP decision. So there are these sorts of commitments. There's a range of options there. Of course, the ones that want these nationally determined contributions to be achieved are the small island states, the least developed countries, the usual sort of suspects. As far as housing is concerned, and this is relevant for various reasons, it has some legal relevance, but it's primarily practical relevance. Nationally determined contributions could be housed in the agreement itself. So they could be in annexes, attachments, appendices, or they could be outside the agreement. They could be in COP decisions, information documents, miscellaneous documents, all the sorts of instruments I was talking about. They could be held by the Secretariat. They could be on the website. They could be in an online registry. They could be on flyers distributed in the COP. I mean, it could be anywhere outside the instrument. The relevance of this is practical, and it has practical and policy implications. It has some legal implications, but only tangential, because, as I said, the key aspect that determines legal character or legal nature of these nationally determined contributions is the commitment you have in the agreement with respect to them. So you could have these nationally determined contributions on the website, but if the legally binding instrument says that these numbers that have been reflected on the website have to be achieved, then it's legally binding, right? It doesn't matter where it is. So housing is not relevant for the purposes strictly of that legal character of the NDCs. What's interesting is that the nationally determined contributions can be updated unilaterally or multilaterally, and that also has policy and practical implications. You could just have, as we do, you have an online portal for INDCs, parties submit them, they have access to this online portal, and whenever they want, they update it. That's entirely possible. So it could be unilaterally updated, in which case these will be very dynamic, and in fact it'll be difficult to even keep track of everybody's NDCs. You could have a multilateral process that needs to be embarked upon for updating nationally determined contributions, which would then have some checks and balances in terms of how frequently it can be done, whether it's going to be upwards or downwards, and all of that. So the practical and policy implications of where these nationally determined contributions are housed is, first, if it's in the agreement, it is part of the package that states would actually have to ratify in Paris. And that's interesting because, and I think this is to some extent a contrived issue, but the Americans are arguing we don't want to ratify everybody else's nationally determined contributions. We don't want to have any, they're nationally determined, countries are doing it. We don't want to have to ratify, not in a sort of legal sense, but we don't want to have to actually have any sense of endorsement of anybody else's NDCs. Everybody puts them into the Paris package, and we don't want it in the agreement because then there would be some signaling that we're actually endorsing these. I think this argument is somewhat contrived because the Kyoto Protocol also has commitments of other countries, and it doesn't suggest that each country is ratifying the commitment of every other country. It just suggests that this is part of the legal instrument. Housing has practical implications if you want to have NDCs that are easily updatable. So if you have them on a website, as I said, in combination with the fact that they unilaterally, it's possible to unilaterally update them. You can update them, at the press the click of a sort of key basically. So they can be updated very easily in that way. If you have them inside the agreement, if you have them in annexes, even if you have fast-track amendment procedures, it would still be a lot more tedious. And of course, political visibility. If you have them outside the agreement, there's less political visibility for them. Housing could also have legal implications, and that's only in case the anchoring provision, the provision that talks about the commitments, is unclear or constructively ambiguous, which is something we love in these negotiations. If you have very constructively ambiguous language, then if you have it on the website, then the legal status of that is very sort of uncertain, whereas if it's constructively ambiguous but you have it as part of the agreement, then the legal status of the NDC is derived from the house where they're located. So just quickly, I know I've been sort of rattling on for a bit, just one or two quick slides on differentiation, housing and anchoring, just to make the point that it's actually possible to differentiate both in relation to where NDCs are located. You could have different annexes, different lists, different COP decisions for different countries, groups of countries, different types of contributions, adaptation, mitigation. You could also have different commitments in relation to the nationally determined contributions of different parties. And we had conversation about this earlier today. You could have obligations of effort for developing countries, obligations of result for developed countries. So it's all of these are still on the table. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I'd like to highlight the fact that we actually don't have at the moment any clarity on how we can convert the intended nationally determined contributions that countries are putting forward into nationally determined contributions. What will it actually take? Right now we have no clarity even on the scope of the nationally determined contributions. Some countries are putting in mitigation only, some countries are putting in mitigation and adaptation, some are putting in mitigation, adaptation, capacity building, all of it. Some of it is conditional, some of it is unconditional. So it's informational requirements that were provided in Lima were also very sketchy and they're very discretionary. So it's very unclear what these are and what the process will be for converting this sort of mixed bag of NDCs that we're going to get, INDCs we're going to get into NDCs. Also, one interesting question is whether NDCs will be a condition for joining the agreement. Does a country actually have to provide a nationally determined contribution before it's allowed to participate in this? And then the issue of what the scope of these NDCs will be is very important. So just finally, on a few concluding remarks. On legal form of the 2015 agreement, it's very clear that there is an emerging understanding it will be a treaty. Whether we call it a protocol or not, it will be a treaty, be in written form, it will be between states, and it will be governed by international law, and it doesn't matter what's called. But the question is what will be in that instrument and what will not be in that instrument, and which elements of that instrument will lend themselves to enforcement, which elements will not lend themselves to enforcement, and what sort of entry into force requirements should we have. And on the issue of legal nature of nationally determined contributions, there are questions about whether it should be in or outside the agreement, and what the nature of the obligation should be in relation to them. Should there be just procedural obligations or procedural and substantive obligations, obligations of effort or result, and whether they should be differentiated. So these are, key issues that are in the negotiations that are being discussed now quite thoroughly in informal legal discussions that are happening on the sidelines of these negotiations. And by informal, I mean it's still with the negotiators, but it's not in the formal UNFCCC process. There is no space currently in the UNFCCC process to actually discuss all these legal issues, which is of some concern because, as you can see, they're quite complicated. And if we don't actually discuss them until the last night in Paris, we're going to be left with a serious problem. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I'm sure the commentators will have much to add.
Great. Great. Thank you, Lavanya. Exhaustive and clear at the same time. Thank you. Just want to welcome Ambassador Saran, who's also joined us in the room. So we have a wonderful group of people in the room to take these issues forward. Let me turn to you, Ambassador Dasgupta, for the first set of comments, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We just listened to a fascinating presentation from Professor Rajamani, a closely reasoned, thoroughly researched, and elegantly presented argument. As a legal layman, I have no intention of commenting on a presentation, but I venture to make a couple of quick observations regarding this question of what Professor Rajamani sort of headlined as the legal nature of NDCs, and which I would prefer to label the legal nature of INDCs. Her presentation assumes that there is a transition at some stage, a conversion of INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions, to nationally determined contributions. I would suggest, however, there is nothing in the Lima Agreement or in any preceding COP decision which requires a transition at least till the end of the period to which INDC relates. In other words, an INDC, intended nationally determined contribution, remains an intended contribution till the conclusion of the period to which it refers, 2025 or 2030. It becomes a nationally determined contribution when the final results are known, not before. And now this, I think, goes to the root issue, the fundamental issue of the legal nature of the agreement which will emerge in Paris. Are we looking at a compilation of aims, of intentions of countries, intended nationally determined contributions, or are we looking at a list of commitments, legally binding commitments of some sort or the other, mandatory requirements? I feel that there are very good reasons and also much political support from influential players in favor of letting these remain, statements of intent. That is to say, an INDC remains an INDC. And let me explain why. A legally binding agreement, that is to say, a mandatory, imposing mandatory requirements, is conducive to predictability, but not ambition. If you are asking a state party to declare a goal for the implementation of which it will be held accountable, it will be an unambitious goal. But if you want to generate maximum effort, and surely that must be the attempt at Paris, then what you are looking for is something more, an aspirational goal, with the intention of promoting the maximum possible effort to cope with the climate change issue. Now, it doesn't, which one do we prefer after all? You have a target of 100 and you achieve 90, falling short of the target, or you have a target of 10 and achieve 10. It seems to me that it's the former that is the target, and given the very ambitious targets that some developing countries are putting forward, I think it's an excellent thing, conducive to obtaining the maximum results from Paris if these remain intended nationally determined contributions, rather than an effort is made to translate these into some form of binding commitments. But aside from this, I think there's very strong political support for a compilation of intended efforts. If I understand correctly, and this is true of the United States, certainly true of India, it's true of China, we don't want, we don't think that what I call legally binding or mandatory commitments are going to elicit the maximum possible effort or the best attempt to cope with climate change. Now, obviously an intended nationally determined contribution is not legally binding in the sense that it's not mandatory. It's a best effort sort of type of agreement. So what are the legally binding clauses in such an agreement? It seems to me that the Paris outcome will probably have 2 or possibly 3 types of quote-unquote legally binding commitments. One, a commitment to submit INDCs. Secondly, a commitment to report on implementation. And thirdly, very likely, a commitment to update the INDCs periodically. So these will be legally binding requirements. And in that sense, the outcome will have legal force. But the INDCs themselves will remain precisely INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions. And as regards the housing, Professor Rajmani has made a brilliant presentation and showed us the implications of the various ways in which we establish a linkage between the main sort of Paris Agreement and these INDCs and the question of housing the INDCs. From what she said, my initial sort of inclination would be to place them in the form not of an information document, but rather information documents in the plural. That is, each country has a separate information document left to itself. Why? Firstly, the very length of these INDCs. Now, the INDCs which we received run into 4, 5, or even more pages. It's not simply a question of setting out targets, but explaining what are the assumptions on which they are based, explaining explaining how they are compatible with the level of required ambition, with Article 2 and so on and so forth. So these would be pretty lengthy documents, and I think one way of doing it might be to have it in the shape of separate information documents. This also avoids the question of having to decide on differentiation. I mean, you put developed countries in one document, developing countries in another document, and so on and so forth. That listing problem would get solved. Now, of course, it could be put on the website. Now, I'm not sufficiently aware of what the legal implications of putting it in the website are, or how they would be put on the website, as information documents related separately, individually to each country, or would it be a list? If it's a list, would it be done in order of chronological submission or in alphabetical order, or would there be some difference in classification? All these, will, I think, have to remain indebted to Professor Rajuni for future guidance on these issues. This is the first set of. The other point I wanted to touch on briefly is this: the Lima outcome, and indeed all previous outcomes, call on each party, on every party, on all parties to submit their INDCs. We are not seeing this in the case of the European Union. The European Union has submitted one single INDC. And what it says is that this is the target which the European Union has set itself as a collective target. Now that is not sufficient, because in the convention, the European Union, or rather the European Commission, is listed as a party, but every member of the European Union is listed separately as a party. Therefore, we need clarification from the European Union as to whether this target is supposed only to be a collective target, or whether it applies also individually and severally to each member state of the European Union. Clarification on this is essential, and there is a legal precedent in the Kyoto Protocol, where in the annex setting out KEL rules, you have a European Union target or a European Commission target, and then separately each EU country. So I think this is a very important point on which clarification is required from the EU. I've run out of time, it's exactly 9 minutes, so I'll halt here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dasgupta. May I turn to Professor Rangreji, please?
Good evening, and thank you, Lavanya, for that wonderful presentation. I think there are not many legal issues that really are left to be covered as regards the agreement in 2015. And I've not been a part of the Indian delegation since Copenhagen, so I've very touchily followed the negotiations. But there are a few issues which I think it's important to remember as regards the legal instruments, or the shape of what these legal instruments could be at the Paris COP. One thing is clear that, as you had written earlier in ICMQ, that the Kyoto Protocol is, it's not dying softly. I think it's about to die a natural death. And one of the reasons for this is the acknowledgement of the fact that this legal form, whatever shape it takes, it would be guided by the principles of the convention. Although my understanding is many principles of these conventions may not be followed in true letter and spirit when you actually have the final form. I think this was one comment I wanted to make. The second issue is, I think one has really moved away from serious multilateral treaty making. I think one of the essential cores of multilateral treaty making was the principle of good faith, that you need to not only negotiate in good faith, but you also need to take the negotiations forward, say in the form of a treaty, as was held in the Lake Leman arbitration between France and Spain, that parties are bound not only to negotiate in good faith, but actually take these negotiations towards a practical result, whereby they can share the hydroelectric resources between the two countries. So I think this particular good faith is missing for various reasons. One of the clear reasons is that those two essential elements of treaty law, especially treaty making and treaty implementation, I think states are not serious about that, and for genuine reasons. Maybe they feel that they are more happy with bilateral processes which they can manage. Say for example in the EU, and this is seen across many treaties. And I think climate change is a very strong victim or a classical victim of this problem of multilateral treaty making, for the simple reason that you have not only disparate players, but you also have states who are together. Say for example in the G77, within that particular thing they have their own strong national interests. So you're not going to have genuine multilateral treaty making where countries are ready to negotiate in good faith, take a bit of this and give it up. There are very strong reasons, and rightly so in many cases, where countries espouse their own national interests. The fourth issue which I wanted to touch, which you already elaborately dealt with in your presentation, is what shape, or specifically the Durban mandate, what is the form of this legal instrument that can come up? Frankly, I believe that if you have a convention under whose general guidance you are going to have an instrument that comes up, it has to be a treaty. It has to be a treaty, as you correctly said in your paper, that if a treaty doesn't have final clauses, or if a treaty devoid of final clauses, then it would not essentially attract those consent requirements or consent to be bound requirements under the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties. And that may be a reason that many countries may not ready to ratify, accede, or fulfill various constitutional obligations. And unlike, say, the Law of the Sea Convention, or you give the example of the Straddling Stocks Convention, where you could have a provisional application, I think the reasons are not going to change overnight, where the country may feel that, I don't think there has been a drastic change in India's policy regarding climate change for the last 10 years. And I don't see overnight it may change. So you're not going to say, let us have a provisional application for 5 years and then look at it whether we actually need to ratify or become a party to this new instrument. So it's largely going to be under the convention, but my feeling is that some of these core principles, especially CBDR and its revised form, I see that they are going to wither down. And if they don't wither down, the international community need not spend so much of money and energy and all these resources on trying to negotiate a new agreement. I'm sure, if you're going to have a convention, you're going to have something new along with it. It's largely going to be regarding bringing on board larger countries like India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and others who would also want to actually take up Annex 1 commitments like in the Kyoto Protocol. As regarding the structured format of whether it's a protocol or whether it's another legal instrument or an agreed outcome with legal force, I think this is these are individual countries' contributions, largely reflecting their own views and their own necessities. But in legal terms, it has to be an instrument. Either it's a treaty or I don't consider a political declaration as an instrument. When you had the Truman Declaration, in 3 days you had Mexico saying that they have a similar declaration with as much longer the law of the sea, territorial waters, continental shelf. So countries are free to come up with declarations. Not to deny that the Copenhagen Declaration was an exception, at least as your paper correctly says, it got together the larger countries and there was some form of political cohesion. But I don't agree it has any legal form. It may be playing to the gallery really to say I was there at Copenhagen and one knows how it has done, and it was not a court decision and it ended out just to be taken note of. So many of these legal forms that may finally come up, I believe that there will be only one single instrument. You may not even have the instrument really in Paris. I think you may just have the building blocks ready, upon which you may have to work upon, and they are not going to go away very much from what was agreed at Bali. You would have mitigation, adaptation, finance, TOT, capacity building, and others. And one needs to be really optimistic if one has to go through party-driven negotiation to say that by Paris you will have an agreement. I think it's too short a period considering the issues at hand. But I'm sure at least some skeletal framework would be ready. Coming to the issue of NDCs, sometimes I believe that it's a genuine demand of states to say that I can only do as much as my capacities allow me. But if you have to look at it as from the flip side, you also believe that this is the best way to obfuscate not only the general structure of an evolving treaty, but to clearly say that what I could not do in Kyoto, I will continue not doing now, also in the future agreement. What value does it really actually add if you have a weak commitment on NDCs in the body of the instrument, and you list hundreds of pages saying that what you intend to do, what you are actually going to do by way of your national contribution. And I think at the end of the day, it's not like you're staying in a glass house that one country can say this is what I have done and it's not going to affect my neighbor. I'm sure whatever little you do or whatever you do in your own capacity, it's not for something which you can do and sleep over. You are surely going to affect your neighbor by that. And if you don't have a strong commitment in the instrument, whether you have this as a separate annex, the MDC, or you have it as as a part of a COP decision, I think it's not going to make a difference. It may legally, as you correctly said, it may make legally a difference if it is an integral part of the instrument itself. I think there are any number of cases to go on to say that if you have a standalone agreement, the standalone agreement lacks legal force unless it is interpreted. All the 5 annexes to the Law of the Sea Convention are integral parts of the convention. To accommodate US interests in the Law of the Sea for mining, you had to have a new agreement in 1994. I'll just take 2 minutes more. So this is my short comments on NDCs. I'm not going to really comment what legal form you'll have, but one should always be careful of the fact that any negotiator should not, at least from the developing country, should not allow the fundamental principles of the UNFCCC to be watered down. If one should be wary of the fact that while allowing and making a lot of concessions, in having a more workable and a more implementable treaty, I think the UNFCCC's guiding principles should be adhered to. Thank you so much.